Hi, I'm Eileen Cavanaugh. Welcome to Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers. We hope you enjoy this discussion of Minnesota literature.
Hi, I'm State Representative Len Burnett. I represent Northeast Minneapolis, which is an area in which there's a wonderful book written about it. It's called Heart and Hard Work by Genny Kieley. It's a book about Northeast Minneapolis, and I'm going to talk to Genny this afternoon about this book. I first heard about the book in December when there was an article in the Star Tribune, and in following the article and noticing that they put together a open house for the next day at Kramarchuk's, I decided to go pick up a copy of this book. Much to my amazement, there were over 100 people in line trying to get autographed copies from this wonderful author. And I'd like to start by asking Genny, how has the response been to your book? Is it like that first day, or has it been the same?
Well, that was quite an overwhelming experience for me, because that was the very first book signing in my whole life. And that particular day, we sold over 450 books.
Wonderful start.
So, but it was just crazy because we weren't really prepared. I brought just a couple people to help me, and they weren't even going to stay. And we were there from about 10 in the morning till 5 that night, signing books, so for 7 hours straight. And people that I hadn't seen for 20, 25 years, people coming out of from my childhood, old neighbors and old schoolmates. It was just unreal, kind of like going through my whole life, my life flashing before me.
I bought 2 copies. I wanted to give one to my mom for Christmas, and I wanted to keep one for myself, and I couldn't put it down that night. It brought back some fond memories of my life in Northeast Minneapolis. I grew up just a few blocks from you. You lived on California, and I was on Laurie and 3rd, and I think we share a lot of things in common. And we share things like the shoemaker shop. I just brought warm memories because I used to deliver paper to that old shoemaker who was in his 90s. And it's a wonderful book with some wonderful photographs. Well, tell me how you got started. What was your idea behind it, and how did you get into this?
Okay, it had to do with my trying to go back to my roots. Started out with some genealogy and looking for. I was interested in the history of that area because those people that came there had common bonds from Europe. And I never knew my grandparents. They all died before I was born. So I wanted to know more about them. And I knew some basics, but I wanted to know, specifics about them coming over. Why did they come over, and what did they bring with them? And, was it a tough life for them when they came over? And I knew they didn't speak the language and they couldn't read or write, so I figured that had to be tough. But I wanted to know about that, so I thought, well, one of the things would be to try to find out the history of that area and the other people that settled there, and perhaps I could find out more about my people. Well, when I went out to look for the history of this area, I was really kind of surprised that there wasn't anything written about it. And I thought, oh, there'd be at least one book about it. Well, I started asking questions at the libraries, and went to the Historical Society and tried to see what I could find out. Well, I found a few things, you know, bits and pieces in other books, and of course there was always newspaper ads or newspaper articles, things like that. And then as I was asking questions, I found that people were really interested in this topic. Now, whether they were from Northeast or not, people just seemed to kind of perk up their ears whenever I talked about it. And the more I talked about it, I think the more people would say, well, you should call so-and-so, they'll know. You know, I wanted to know who were the first settlers and you know, what brought them there, and you know, what were the circumstances surrounding that. And when people would give me, you know, maybe 6 different phone numbers of different people, and then I'd call them, and then that person would give me another 6. And like I said, people that weren't even from there had some kind of connection there. You know, they would have maybe a relative, an older relative, or a friend of the family that lived over there, and they always had a little story. Oh, we used to go over there, and Grandma would bake cookies, and she had a little porch, and you know, same kind of memories as what I had. And I started to collect things, photos and articles, and took note of what people had to say, and pretty soon I had this notebook, and it was getting bigger and bigger. And then one day someone said, well, you know, you're always so angry that they didn't write about Northeast. Well, you know, why don't you write about Northeast? And I said, oh, well, you know, maybe that could work. But I think at first it was just kind of for my own family and for my own information, and it started to broaden more and more. And one day I had found a publisher that was interested in it. Surprised the heck out of me, but he was interested in a real small press, and you know, but I didn't really believe that it would ever come to be. But you know, the more I worked on it, and the more we talked about it, the more it became a reality.
You've assembled just some wonderful photographs. Where did you get most of these?
The photos, a lot of them were given to me by people, or a lot of them came from the historical societies. Some were from yearbooks. This is just one small part of the photos that I had collected. I think I collected something like 300 or 400 photos. And so there's 150, I believe, in there.
And it's wonderful because as we sit here in Jack's garden, very close to Northwestern Casket, next to Center Store, Shear Brothers Lover down the street, Northern States Power, all the things, the early photos of the area that I grew up in, pictures from 1915 all the way from 1945. Wonderful collection of all the churches. It's just well done overall. And you got it all in just one book, or are you thinking about writing another one?
Yes, I am doing a second part.
And what would that?
Well, it's going to be a continuation of this book, so it'll be book 2. I'm not sure if we'll call it Heart and Hard Work. We're thinking about calling it A Sense of Place, More Memories of Northeast Minneapolis. And what's nice about it, I guess, how this all got started was people would call me and say, well, you didn't include my church, or you didn't include such and such a business. And so they all had these things to add. And although I kind of started this book alone, I did have some help. Well, now with the second book, I'm getting all kinds of help. So people from all over the country have called me.
Genny, will the new edition of the book follow the format of this one? Will it be different in any way? How are you gathering information for this one?
Okay. Well, I'm inviting the people from Northeast, or wherever they happen to live now, to send me things. Pictures, memories. If they don't have, I'd love to have people write down their own memories about different stores, or if they knew of a shoemaker or a barber or somebody like that was close to them. But if they don't, and if they just want a specific store to be mentioned in the book, I'd like to hear about that. So I'm inviting people to tell me what they want in this book.
How do they contact you?
They could contact Noden Press.
Okay.
So, and that's located in the Warehouse District in North Minneapolis.
And do you think the edition is going to be similar to this, or an expanded version?
It'll be very similar, except that in some cases I exhausted the possibilities, so I'll have to vary it a little bit. The history, I tried to gather as much history as I could as far as the events that formed Minneapolis, and I already covered that. But I'm hoping to cover some different things. I like to have a little variety. I certainly don't want to have the second book be exactly the same, although people liked it, so I certainly will go
Well, I
with
would
most
imagine
of
a lot of people from Northeast will contact you with their stories that are missing.
Yes.
In their early childhood years, maybe photographs, maybe newspaper clippings. You have a few newspaper clippings in here. That would certainly generate, I think, a lot of interest and become a book that's kind of a team effort, as this one has been.
Yeah, and that's what's so nice about it, I think, is that I had so many contributions of ideas from other people. And that's really what I wanted, was to get a book that where it's a collaborative effort. You can always do better when you have more head than one.
Absolutely, absolutely. Again, I look forward to looking at that new edition. When do you think it might be out?
We're talking about next fall, or at least by next Christmas.
So people should be contacting you very early, because there'll be another long line at Kamarchik's as you get this thing in press.
It takes probably a good 6 months or so just to put the book together once I gather the information. So that's after it's written. So yeah, hopefully people will do that, and I can't really write things unless I get the information. So.
Well, I will certainly talk to my family, and we'll get a few things sent to you.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, I started kind of with the idea of some of the ethnic groups, and like I said, I was specifically interested in my family, which was the Polish background, and most of the Polish people there that settled in Northeast were from the southern part of Poland. But as I got started, I realized there was much more people than just the Polish. We only went a few blocks, so we knew all the Polish, but there's all kinds of ethnic groups in Northeast Minneapolis. And I want customs and traditions, things. I'm going to include the rest of the churches, One guy said to me, well, how come you only included the Catholic churches? So, well, now I'm going to do the other churches too.
Tell me about the title. Why does this represent Northeast Minneapolis, heart and hard work?
Oh, yeah. Well, it was one of probably about 5 or 6 titles that I chose. The hard work, of course, has to do with those immigrant people in Northeast Minneapolis. You couldn't stop them from working. I mean, they were the blue-collar workers, and poor, and they kind of had to prove themselves when they came to this country. They were uneducated, so the only thing they could do was to work. And they would work, some people around the clock, whether they were owned businesses or whether they were just residential people. My grandfather was a laborer on the Sioux Line Railroad, and it was amazing how that was the only thing they could do to bring themselves up, and they did that. And I think in a way the hard work is sort of connected to education too, although they weren't necessarily educated. In fact, they weren't educated when they came here, but they thought of education as being real important for their children. They wanted a better life for their children, and so that was the only way they could do it, was through work. And the heart has to do with, I know my own family, it was very common for us to, even when we were poor, we would take food to someone who was worse off than we were, whether they were sick or, I think my mother and my grandparents used to feed the hobos that came by. off the train because we were close to the train. And all of my life I knew about charity. I mean, and the people over Northeast, that's such a representation of them, because even today, people that are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s are going to visit the people that are a little bit older in the nursing homes and taking them food and taking care of them. And so there's always that kind of mentality of caring about one another.
And that's kind
So
of
it's
what
very
I
appropriate.
remember of my childhood. I attended some of the same stores that you attended, and the proprietors would recognize me as a child, know who my parents were, let me charge things.
It made a big difference,
It
didn't
made a
it?
big difference, and always it was a real sense of community.
Yeah.
The small local stores that, and from which all the community just attended was a wonderful thing. People went to the same churches, people prayed together, and they worked hard together. My grandparents came in 1918 from Poland and started working. Actually, my great uncle worked as a laborer at Sioux Line, like yours.
Yeah.
And
Well,
then
we
my
really have a
grandfather
lot in common.
started a store, and that was a way to get around. So it's been a great community built on heart and hard work. And I sense that as we go along. Now, how's your book been selling in terms of numbers? How many people have purchased this so far? And
Well, the first printing sold out in about 2 months' time.
wow,
And, well, you could have just knocked me over with a feather, because, you know, people would call me or they'd write me letters from all over the country, even all over the world. I had people in other countries that were interested in this book. And who would ever think that my book would go to Okinawa or to, I believe one went to Africa. You know, this is Northeast Minneapolis.
and I guess
You
you're
know.
going to find a few getting to Poland and some Ukrainian countries
Oh,
and
I'm
Russia.
sure.
There are a few
I'm sure,
in
and there probably is already.
We are now at the second stop on our mini tour of Northeast Minneapolis, Kramarczuk's, located on 215 East Hennepin Avenue. In this book, the author writes and describes the founding of this company as follows. Basil and his wife saved $5,000 and opened up a sausage company at 2010 Marshall Street. When his partner disappeared with all the money, Basil simply made plans to begin again. With the money he made as a landlord and cash he received from relatives, he started this particular sausage company, which still exists now today. And as we sit here, we can smell the wonderful food not too far away from the brewery, and we want to continue our story. What do people most like about this book?
I think probably the comments I've gotten the most are they love the photographs. And one of the special things that I wanted in this book is I wanted to have the pictures of the old schools. In the 60s and 70s, during the urban renewal, all of these schools in Minneapolis were torn down. And I believe there was something like 10 schools that were torn down in Northeast Minneapolis. And people have a special attachment to these schools. And so knowing the way I felt about my old school, and every time I heard anything about it, I kind of took a little dare there and decided to put all these pictures of the old schools in there. And I don't know if my publisher was too thrilled with that, but people just love that. They love the pictures of the old schools. And the churches, I know there was one day when I went to a place called the Polish Soup Fest in the International Building in St. Paul, where they were selling soup and different things that had to do with Polish culture. And I brought a few books over there. They said I could sell some books. And the very first time I had an idea of the response to this book was a lady picked the book up and she was paging through, and she saw a picture of her church in the very early days when it was called the Chapel of St. Anthony. And she saw that picture and she started to cry. And she told me thank you and was just ecstatic about how I included this picture. And to me, that was the very first time that I had any inkling of what this was going to mean to the people. And I think a lot of people feel like it's a scrapbook of theirs, or of their own family. I know I've gotten a lot of comments about the first chapter in the book, which is actually my own story, the story of my grandparents and the story of my family and how they came to Northeast Minneapolis. And it was basically just put in there as an introduction to try to get to know me a little bit, and so that they would know me and know a little bit about the type of book that I would write. So I wrote this stuff about my family, just thinking that, you know, people would just sort of skim over it. And that's probably the most comments I've got on this book has been about that first chapter. In fact, the Star Tribune did a whole article on basically my family, almost the whole thing. And people feel like it's kind of a story of their own family, their own immigrants who came. And I suppose, you know, there's a lot of commonality of all of that.
You've covered so many different parts of Northeast. We all have memories of schools. I look at Schiller School, where my father went to school, and which was torn down as part of that renewal. I look at Holy Cross Church, where I grew up and still attend. It's just
and the
wonderful
bowling alley.
The bowling alleys here, the restaurants. You can go through this page by page, and certainly memories of my grandparents, memories of my father and mother, and memories of my childhood. And I think that's what makes this book emotionally, I think, bonding for all of us who have any kind of attachment to Northeast.
I should have counted how many people told me that they cried, because so many people would call me and they'd say, "You have just made my dad's Christmas or my grandfather's Christmas." And people told me that they never read anything and they read my book. I had a few people that were in their late 90s that called me and said how much they loved my book.
It's the wealth of photographs, and you know, close to where we sit right now, we have the Grain Belt Brewery, which you cover in several ways in the book. You want to tell us about that?
Well, there's one kind of an interview of a guy that worked at the brewery, and he tells about some things about how different family members were hired at the brewery for different little tasks, and one of the cousins was hired, I guess, to kill the rats on the riverbank back in time. And people seem to love to hear things like that. It just takes us back to a simpler life, and kind of just a little bit of a reprieve from our busy life. People love that. And I guess I had no idea that they would love it as much as they do, though. I mean, I just figured I was the only one that sat around and talked about those things. And my own family is very much a remember when type of family, but there's all kinds of people around that are that way. And especially people from Northeast are real nostalgic people.
But yet sometimes life comes full circle. In your book you show pictures of trolley cars going down Central Avenue, and now we're talking about putting light rail back over there.
Right.
We're looking at East Hennepin rejuvenation, Central rejuvenation. We're looking at almost returning to the ways it were. We are going back to community schools. People are having more strength in their neighborhoods and trying to be more involved in schools and education. So in some ways maybe Northeast is returning from its roots to what was the good life.
I hope so. I know one of the things that people have also commented on is people like to quiz me about this book. They'll say, they'll try to stump me with something from the past, like several people have said, what did they used to call the Northeast Neighborhood House? And of course it was the Nut House. Well, they loved that name for it. And one of my dreams, kind of in the back of my mind with this book, is that I had hoped that maybe we could go back to some of those old ways, because the neighborhood house, and there were several other, the Margaret Berry House, I believe there's a Pillsbury House in North Minneapolis called the Pill House. I'm hoping to go back to some of those things and to take care of our kids, because that's our future. And a lot of the young people are moving into this area, and they got to get a good start, and so they can run the world.
And the neighborhood house, the Northeast Nut House, still does exist, and they right now have plans for a new building. They're in the middle of a $7 million capital campaign to build right across the street where they used to have the Fleshman Towers that have now been torn down, right across from Center's grocery store. So that whole area already has one new school, a new vision school, and we're going to see more rejuvenation. And their plan is to move out there and create a block and also a link to the river. We're seeing much more redevelopment in the area of Marshall Street and making the river more accessible to communities. We're seeing the Boom Island area just a few blocks from here with new homes, suburban type homes. We also see more parkland being established near Boom Island. It's a great place for people to launch boats, to use a river again as they did when I was a kid. The river was useful when I was a child, but we seem to have lost that. So the connection is coming back.
Yeah. There was a time when everybody was moving out to the suburbs, and I suppose some still are, but it's got to swing around again.
I think it is swinging around. In Northeast Minneapolis in particular, the housing values are skyrocketing. Young families are moving in. It is a place to live in Minneapolis, so we're really seeing things in a positive way.
Well, they're even making movies in Northeast Minneapolis.
They sure are. Hopefully, we've got a couple of theaters that closed down years ago. Maybe they can reopen those.
I hope so.
Well, that concludes our little tour of Northeast Minneapolis, and this book, which I recommend highly, A Heart in Hard Work, the story of really Northeast Minneapolis. And this is one, but another one is coming out by December 1999. And if you have questions or comments and want to have input in this second edition, who do they write to, Jenny?
You can either write or call Noden Press. It's located on 6th Avenue North in the Warehouse District, kind of in the downtown area.
And congratulations on this outstanding book, and we look forward to your next one.
Thank you.